The dust of the high trail clung to everything, a fine red powder that coated Abel's leather chaps and settled in the deep lines of his beard. He was a man built of the mountain itself, broad and solid, with hair the color of pine bark that fell past his shoulders. His journey to the settlement for salt and flour was a necessary evil, a brief descent into a world of noise and judgment he preferred to leave behind. Now, returning to the quiet solitude of his ranch nestled in the granite peaks, a scene on the path ahead brought his horse to a halt. A wiry man in a sweat-stained suit stood beside a slight figure in a tattered white dress. The man, whose face was a pinched mask of impatience, held a piece of paper like a weapon. The woman, small and still, was Chinese, her face a pale oval of exhaustion, dark eyes fixed on the unforgiving ground. Abel felt the familiar coil of trouble in his gut, the kind that always seemed to find him when he strayed too far from his own territory. He dismounted, the sound of his heavy boots on the hard-packed earth drawing two sets of eyes. The wiry man's gaze was sharp and dismissive, instantly cataloging Abel's worn clothes and immense frame as little more than a rustic obstacle. The woman's eyes, however, held a flicker of something else. Not hope, but a deep, bottomless fear that seemed to recognize a new kind of danger in his approach. Her husband, a gambler with hollowed-out eyes, had already vanished down the trail, his hurried footsteps the final sound of her betrayal. She had been the last chip he had to play, the final settlement for a debt he could never repay with coin. The man with the paper was named Finch. He ran the saloon in the nearest settlement, a place where men lost their wages, their pride, and sometimes their souls. "This is private business, friend," Finch said, his voice thin and reedy, a stark contrast to the vast, silent landscape around them. He gestured with the paper toward the young woman. "A contract, all legal and binding. The property now belongs to me." Abel's eyes moved from Finch's sneering face to the woman. Property. The word landed like a stone in the heavy summer air. She stood with a stillness that was not calm, but rigid, like a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. Her white prairie dress, once perhaps a symbol of a new beginning, was torn at the hem and stained with the grime of a life unraveling. She couldn't be more than 22, her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. Abel didn't look at the paper. He looked at her, at the faint tremor in her slender frame, the way she refused to meet anyone's gaze. He knew the kind of man Finch was, and he knew what fate awaited a woman considered his property. His silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. The mountain air, usually a balm to his spirit, felt charged with an impending storm. He had come seeking peace and found a moral precipice. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not simply ride away and leave her to the coming darkness. His decision was not a thought, but an instinct, a force rising from the core of his being. Finch bristled under the weight of Abel's silent scrutiny. "Look, mountain man, I don't know what business you think you have here, but this is a transaction. Her husband, a fool named Way, owed me a considerable sum. He offered his wife as collateral. He defaulted." He waved the paper again, its edges fluttering in the faint breeze. "It's all here, signed and witnessed." Abel's gaze remained fixed on the woman. He saw the subtle flinch at the mention of her husband's name, the slight bow of her head that spoke of shame and profound loss. He had built his life on a simple code. You don't take what isn't yours, and you don't harm what can't defend itself. Finch was violating both principles with a casual cruelty that turned Abel's stomach. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "How much was the debt?" Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark. "More than you've got, I'd wager. $100. It was a fortune, an impossible sum for most men in this part of the country, and certainly for a man who lived off the land. Finch clearly thought the number would end the conversation, but Abel wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the coldness in the man's eyes, the possessive way his gaze lingered on the woman. Abel slowly unstrapped a leather pouch from his saddle. He didn't have $100. He had 20, saved for necessities and emergencies. He opened it and poured the coins into his large, calloused palm. "I'll give you $20, he said, his voice flat and even, "for her freedom. You walk away." Finch's face contorted with derision. 20? Are you insane? She's worth 5 times that for a season's work at my establishment. Now move along before you get hurt. Abel didn't move. He stood his ground, a mountain of a man whose stillness was more threatening than any overt gesture. He met Finch's glare. "She's not for sale." Then he did something unexpected. He looked directly at the young woman, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He spoke to her, not Finch. "You can come with me. You'll be safe." She looked up, startled, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. For the first time, someone had addressed her as a person, not an object. Finch stepped forward. "You have no right!" But he stopped short as Abel took a single deliberate step toward him. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. Finch, for all his bluster, was a predator who preyed on the weak. He was not a fighter. He looked from Abel's determined face to the coin still glinting in his hand, then back to the woman. With a snarled curse, he snatched the coins from Abel's palm. "Fine, take the damaged goods. But you've made an enemy today, giant." He turned and stalked off down the trail, his anger a palpable force trailing behind him. Abel didn't watch him go. His attention was solely on the woman left behind, a fragile piece of driftwood on a hostile shore. He gentled his voice. "It's all right now. He's gone." She remained frozen, her ordeal far from over, now facing a new, uncertain fate with a stranger as formidable as the wilderness itself. The journey to his ranch was made in silence. He walked, leading his horse, while she followed a few paces behind, a small, ghost-like figure against the towering pines. The trail grew steeper, winding up into the high country where the air was thin and clean. Abel's property was a testament to solitude and hard work. A sturdy log cabin stood in a clearing, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A well-tended garden grew beside it, and a small corral housed a pair of goats. It was a world away from the dust and desperation of the trail below. He led her to the cabin door, holding it open. She hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting around the simple, masculine interior. A large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, shelves filled with preserved goods, and a single bed in the corner. It was clean and orderly, but it was the home of a man who lived alone. He seemed to understand her fear. "You can have the loft," he said, pointing to a ladder leading up to a small sleeping area above. "It's private. No one will bother you." She gave a small, jerky nod and climbed the ladder without a word, disappearing from view. Abel let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had acted on pure instinct, a righteous anger that had momentarily overshadowed the practicalities of his decision. Now the reality set in. He had a stranger in his home, a woman who had been through an unimaginable trauma, who didn't speak his language, and who was now entirely dependent on him. He set about his evening chores, feeding the animals and tending the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. He prepared a simple meal of stew and bread, the familiar actions a comfort in the unsettling new quiet of his home. He filled a bowl and a cup of water, placing them at the bottom of the ladder. "Food!" he called up softly. There was no response. He waited for a moment, then went outside to eat his own meal on the porch, watching as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. When he returned later, the bowl and cup were gone. He felt a small measure of relief. It was a start. He banked the fire for the night and settled into his bed, the familiar creak of the ropes seeming louder than usual. Above him, in the darkness of the loft, was a silence that was not empty, but filled with the weight of another person's pain and fear. For the first time in years, Abel was not alone in his mountain sanctuary, and the knowledge brought with it a profound and unsettling sense of responsibility. Days bled into a week, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. A fragile routine began to form, built on silence and observation. Abel would rise before dawn, work his land, and leave food for her. She remained mostly in the loft, a shadow he rarely saw. But slowly she started to venture down when he was outside. He would catch glimpses of her standing in the doorway, her slight frame silhouetted against the dark interior of the cabin. She watched him work, her gaze intense and searching, as if trying to understand the nature of the man who had saved her. He never pushed, never demanded anything of her. He simply existed, a steady and predictable presence in her chaotic world. One afternoon he was weeding the vegetable garden, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked the soil. He looked up to find her standing a few feet away, holding a small, chipped bowl. She pointed to the wild berry bushes growing near the edge of the woods. He nodded, understanding. "They're good to eat." He watched as she spent the next hour carefully picking the ripest berries, her movements graceful and precise. When the bowl was full, she brought it to him, holding it out as an offering. It was the first gesture of trust, a bridge across the chasm of their silence. He took a berry and ate it, its sweetness bursting in his mouth. "Thank you," he said. She offered a small, hesitant smile in return, the first he had ever seen on her face. It transformed her, chasing away some of the shadows from her eyes. That evening she didn't retreat to the loft immediately after taking her food. She sat on the bottom step of the ladder, eating her stew while he sat at his table. The space between them was still vast, but it no longer felt like a void. It was simply a distance waiting to be crossed. "My name is Abel," he said into the quiet. She looked at him, then touched her own chest. "Lynn," she whispered, her voice soft and unused. The name was beautiful, simple, and it felt momentous, as if he were finally meeting the person behind the fear. "Lynn," he repeated, testing the sound of it. It fit her. He told her about his life in brief, simple sentences, how he had come to the mountains to escape the noise of the world, how he had built the cabin with his own hands. She listened, her head tilted, and though he knew she understood little of the actual words, she seemed to grasp the meaning behind them, the story of a man who, like her, was an outsider seeking refuge. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered 2 weeks later. Abel was splitting firewood when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He straightened up, axe in hand, his body tensing. It was Finch, and this time he had brought a burly, sour-faced man with him. They rode into the clearing and dismounted, their presence an immediate violation of the quiet mountain air. Finch's eyes, small and venomous, scanned the property before landing on Abel. "I've come for what's mine," he said, foregoing any pretense of civility. "The $20 was a rental fee. Now the contract is due." Abel planted the head of the axe into the chopping block, the solid thud echoing in the clearing. "She is not yours. I told you that." From inside the cabin the door creaked open. Lynn stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with renewed terror. The sight of her seemed to embolden Finch. "There she is. Still looking a bit ragged, but I can fix that. My customers aren't too particular." The brutish man beside him chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "You're a fool if you think you can keep her, mountain man," Finch sneered. "I have a legal document. The law in this territory is on the side of property owners." Abel stepped forward, placing himself directly between them and the cabin door. He was not a violent man by nature, but a protective instinct, fierce and absolute, rose within him. He was a wall, a fortress, and he would not be moved. "The only law up here is what's right," Abel said, his voice dangerously low. "And you, sir, are on the wrong side of it. You took my money. Our business is concluded. Get off my land." Finch's face flushed with anger. "You think you can just intimidate me? I'll go to the marshal. I'll tell him you've stolen my property." He took a step forward, but his companion put a hand on his arm, his eyes warily measuring Abel's sheer size and the cold fury in his expression. The man was a hired thug, not a zealot. He understood the difference between a paid job and a foolish death. He murmured something to Finch, who, after a moment of furious hesitation, seemed to reconsider a direct confrontation. "This isn't over," Finch spat, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll be back. With the law." He climbed back onto his horse, his companion following suit. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a torrent of threats hanging in the air. Abel stood motionless until they were out of sight, his fist clenched. He turned to see Lynn still standing in the doorway, trembling. The sanctuary had been breached. The outside world, with all its cruelty and greed, had found them. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken threat of Finch's return. Abel knew the man was right about one thing. A piece of paper, no matter how unjust, often held more power than a moral conviction in the eyes of the law. A marshal from the settlement would likely see a simple property dispute, and Lynn, with no status and no voice, would be the one to suffer. Abel stared into the flickering flames of the hearth, turning the problem over and over in his mind. He could try to fight them off, but that would only lead to bloodshed and make him a fugitive. He could try to send her away, but where would she go? She would be just as vulnerable, alone in a hostile country. There was only one solution he could see, a radical and binding one that would give her the one thing Finch's contract could not overcome: a legal identity, a name, his name. The thought was staggering. He was a man who had chosen solitude, who had built a life devoid of entanglement. Marriage was a foreign concept, a bond he had never sought. Yet, as he glanced towards the ladder to the loft where Lynn was hiding, he knew he couldn't abandon her. His protection had to be absolute, a shield forged in the very laws Finch sought to use against them. He waited until she came down for her evening meal. She moved with a skittish energy, her eyes constantly darting towards the door as if expecting Finch to reappear at any moment. He let her eat, not wanting to frighten her further. When she was finished, he spoke her name softly. "Lynn." She looked up, her expression guarded. He chose his words carefully, speaking slowly and clearly. "Finch will come back with the marshal." He saw the understanding and the fear dawn in her eyes. "He has a paper. The law might listen to him." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But if you have a husband, if you have my name, his paper means nothing. A wife cannot be a debt." She stared at him, her lips slightly parted. The full weight of his words settled between them. He was offering her not just his name, but his entire life as a shield. It was not a proposal of love or romance, but of survival, a contract of a different kind. "We can go to the settlement," he continued, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "See the preacher. Make it legal. It would be a partnership for your safety." He watched her face, searching for her reaction. She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on his. He saw a maelstrom of emotions there, fear, disbelief, and a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. She was being asked to trade one form of bondage for another, to place her trust entirely in a man she barely knew. Finally, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a leap of faith into a future as unknown and wild as the mountains themselves. The journey to the settlement was a tense affair. Abel rode his horse, while Lynn sat behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist. Her touch was hesitant, a constant reminder of the strange and sudden intimacy of their situation. The town was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place of commerce and gossip. As they dismounted in front of the small clapboard church, Abel felt the weight of prying eyes. He was a familiar, if distant, figure to the townsfolk, the giant from the mountains who kept to himself. The sight of him with a young Chinese woman drew immediate and unwelcome attention. Whispers followed them up the steps to the preacher's house. The preacher himself, a stern man named Miller with a face etched by piety and suspicion, was taken aback by their request. "A marriage?" he asked, his eyes flicking from Abel's determined face to Lynn's downcast one. "This is highly irregular, Abel." Abel met his gaze without flinching. "We wish to be married. The law allows for it." Miller hesitated, his gaze lingering on Lynn. "Does she understand what is happening? Does she consent?" Abel looked at Lynn. She straightened her back, meeting the preacher's judgmental stare with a quiet dignity that surprised them both. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. The single word, spoken in perfect English, hung in the air. The preacher, momentarily silenced, could find no further grounds for immediate objection. He reluctantly retrieved his ledger and performed the ceremony in his stuffy parlor. The words were simple, the ritual brief, but for Abel and Lynn they carried the weight of a lifelong vow. As they signed the register, Abel with his strong, deliberate script, Lynn with a graceful character he didn't recognize, he felt a profound shift. She was no longer just a woman he was protecting. She was his wife. The town doctor, a kind, elderly man named Harris, who had treated Abel for a broken arm years ago, was their witness. He signed the book with a sympathetic smile. "You're a good man, Abel," he said quietly as they left. "Don't let this town's narrow mind trouble you." But as they walked back to their horse, the stares and muttered comments followed them like a swarm of angry bees. They were an anomaly, a disruption to the harsh, unwritten social order. Abel felt a new kind of anger, not the hot rage he had felt for Finch, but a slow-burning resentment for a world that would judge an act of decency as a transgression. He helped Lynn onto the horse, his touch lingering for a moment on her arm. They were bound together now, not just by a piece of paper, but by the shared defiance of a world that did not want them. They were halfway back up the mountain trail when the confrontation they had been dreading finally came. Finch and his hired man were waiting for them in a narrow pass, flanked by two other men Abel recognized as local troublemakers. This time Finch held a rifle, and his face was a mask of triumphant malice. "I told you I'd be back," he called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "And I went to see the marshal, just like I said. He was very interested in my stolen property." Abel brought his horse to a stop, his body shielding Lynn. He didn't reach for the rifle in its scabbard on his saddle. He knew this had to be won with words and conviction, not with bullets. "She's not your property, Finch. She's my wife." He said the word wife with a force and clarity that seemed to startle Finch. He held up the freshly signed marriage certificate, a small white square against the vast wilderness. "We were married this morning. It's legal. It's done." Finch's smirk faltered. He stared at the paper, then at Lynn, who sat tall behind Abel, her fear hidden behind a new wall of resolve. "A trick," Finch stammered, his confidence wavering. "A sham. It doesn't count. My contract came first." "Your contract was for a man's debt," Abel countered, his voice ringing with authority. "This is a marriage vow. The law respects that above all else. She is a married woman under my protection. You have no claim on her." The two men Finch had brought with him exchanged uneasy glances. They were bullies and drunks, not men prepared to fight a legal battle against a man like Abel over a matter that now seemed complicated and dangerous. The hired thug from before looked particularly reluctant. Finch, however, was consumed by his rage and humiliation. "I don't care about your paper," he shrieked, raising his rifle. But before he could aim, Abel urged his horse forward, closing the distance between them in a few powerful strides. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply loomed over Finch, his shadow falling across the smaller man. "You will," Abel said, his voice a low and deadly promise. "You will leave us be. You will not come to my land again. You will not speak her name. If you do, the marshal will be the least of your worries." There was no threat of violence in his words, but something far more potent, a promise of unwavering, relentless consequence. It was the certainty of a mountain about to fall. Finch stared up into Abel's granite-hard eyes and saw his own defeat. His bluster evaporated, replaced by a sullen, resentful fear. He lowered the rifle. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, his cronies scrambling to follow, leaving Abel and Lynn alone in the sudden, ringing silence of the high pass. The ride back to the cabin was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared relief. When they arrived, the familiar clearing felt more like a home than ever before. It was a true sanctuary now, defended and secured. That evening, as Abel prepared their meal, Lynn didn't wait for him to serve her. She came to the hearth, took a spare spoon, and began to stir the stew, her movements deft and sure. It was a simple act, yet it spoke volumes. She was no longer a guest, a refugee. She was a partner in this home they now shared. They ate together at the table, the space between them filled not with awkwardness, but with a comfortable, companionable silence. After the meal, she took the bowls to the washing basin, another small domestic act that solidified the change in their dynamic. Abel watched her, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He had offered his name as a shield, a legal maneuver to protect her. He had not anticipated the profound sense of connection it would forge between them. He had not expected it to feel so right. Later, as the fire burned low, he took a spare blanket from his chest and placed it in the loft. "It gets cold up here at night," he said. She looked at him, her dark eyes soft in the firelight. "Thank you, Abel." It was the first time she had said his name. The sound of it on her lips was both strange and wonderful. He retreated to his own bed, but sleep did not come easily. The cabin felt different, charged with a new energy. The legal bond they had formed in the settlement was beginning to grow roots in the quiet soil of their shared life, blossoming into something unexpected. It was more than a partnership for survival. It was the beginning of a family, a unit of two against the world. He had spent years cultivating his solitude, believing it was all he needed. Now the presence of the quiet, resilient woman in the loft above him was filling a void he never knew he had. The summer slowly gave way to the crisp gold of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the rhythm of life on the mountains settled into a new pattern. Lynn was no longer a shadow in the cabin. She filled it with a quiet industry, her presence a gentle counterpoint to Abel's rugged strength. She worked alongside him in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables for winter. She learned to mend his clothes with neat, careful stitches and began to cook their meals, adding herbs she found in the forest that filled the cabin with new, wonderful aromas. Their communication evolved beyond simple words and gestures into a deeper, intuitive understanding. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the way a small smile would touch her lips when she saw him returning from the woods, the flicker of old sadness that still sometimes clouded her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He, in turn, found himself sharing parts of his life he had never spoken of to anyone. He told her about his family, about the reasons he had sought the solitude of the mountains. She listened, her empathy a quiet comfort that eased old wounds. One evening, as a cold wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. He was cleaning a piece of tack, and she was knitting something with yarn he had bought on their last trip to the settlement. "You are a good man," she said softly, her eyes on her work. Her words caught him by surprise. He looked at her, at the way the firelight danced in her dark hair. "I only did what was right." "No," she insisted, looking up to meet his gaze. "Many men see what is right. Few have the courage to do it." In that moment, the last wall around his heart seemed to crumble. The marriage, born of necessity and duty, had transformed into something genuine and profound. It was a bond of respect, of companionship, and a deep, unspoken affection that had grown steadily in the quiet safety of their mountain home. He reached across the small space between them and gently took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. They sat like that for a long time, the silence no longer a void but a shared space of peace and belonging, the crackling fire a warm witness to their unlikely, beautiful love. They had found in each other not just a shield from the world, but a home.